The German soldiers who surrendered in North Africa, France, or Italy anticipated a dire fate upon capture. For years, Nazi propaganda had instilled in them frightening tales of what awaited those unfortunate enough to fall into enemy hands. Forced labor in mines, beatings from guards, starvation rations, and relentless humiliation. Many of these men had grown up hearing such stories, and their imaginations conjured dark images as they were lined up, disarmed, and marched into captivity. Their eyes scanned the American trucks and guards, observing the discipline, yet also the nonchalance with which the Americans treated their captives. Rather than snarling or retaliating, the soldiers offered cigarettes, water, and even a few jokes. Nevertheless, the prisoners remained wary. This had to be some sort of deception. They believed the true cruelty would become apparent once the lengthy journey to America concluded. The transports themselves were another unexpected development. Instead of being crammed into filthy cattle cars with barely any air, many found themselves aboard proper ships or trains, guarded but not mistreated. They were provided with food, including white bread, meat, and coffee, and were allowed to rest. For men raised in wartime scarcity, such treatment was perplexing. They whispered among themselves, "Why waste food on the enemy? Why show kindness to men who had attempted to kill them?" The answers eluded them, and suspicion lingered. Perhaps the Americans aimed to keep them healthy for harsh labor. Perhaps this was a ruse before more severe punishment commenced. Some even speculated they were being fattened for medical experiments, so deeply ingrained were the horror stories from home. As they crossed the Atlantic, gazing at the vast ocean that separated them from their homeland, a heavy silence often enveloped the decks. These men had trained to conquer Europe, to obey Hitler's commands, to see themselves as the chosen warriors of a 1,000-year Reich. Now they found themselves as prisoners, powerless and uncertain of what future lay ahead. America was not the land they had envisioned visiting under such circumstances. Many perceived America merely as a remote industrial giant, characterized by its skyscrapers, jazz music, and Hollywood cinema. However, they found themselves not as tourists or conquerors, but as captives. The initial sight of the American coastline evoked a blend of fear and intrigue. The imposing harbors, extensive cities, and unending rows of factories validated the narratives of American industrial power. The prisoners were awed by the immense scale of everything: the cranes, the ships, the highways. Even prior to reaching their assigned camps, they felt the vastness of the United States and the wealth of resources it possessed. For German soldiers who had fought valiantly with diminishing supplies, the disparity was excruciating. Once they were loaded onto buses and trucks, the journey inland commenced. Through the windows they observed landscapes that were unlike anything in Europe. Broad open fields extending as far as the eye could see, endless roads and small towns adorned with neon signs and gas stations. Children waved as the convoys passed, and locals occasionally gathered to catch a glimpse of the enemy soldiers. The prisoners, in turn, were captivated by the abundance of goods and the comfort found in everyday American life. If this was the land of their captors, what did it imply about the war they had waged? The questions grew increasingly insistent in their minds. Arriving at the camps brought another revelation. They were met with rows of tidy barracks, mess halls, medical facilities, and even areas for recreation. They anticipated barbed wire, indeed, but behind it lay organized amenities rather than filthy prisons. Instead of facing whippings or starvation, they were processed with efficiency, assigned bunks, and provided with uniforms. Some still harbored suspicions of cruelty lurking beneath the surface of order. Others began to contemplate whether America's strength resided not solely in its weaponry, but also in its capacity to treat even its adversaries with an unusual form of humanity. This was merely the beginning. In the upcoming months, German prisoners would encounter further shocks, additional contradictions, and numerous instances that questioned everything they believed about their captors. Yet even at that moment, as they rested in their bunks on that initial night, their full stomachs and fatigue lulling them to sleep, whispers circulated through the barracks. If this is indeed a prison camp, what will happen next? None of them could have anticipated that the next surprise would involve the flickering light of a movie screen. The initial days within the American camps were a study in contrasts. The German prisoners had prepared themselves for shouting guards, humiliating punishments, and relentless hunger. Instead, they faced order and routine. Roll calls were conducted strictly, yet they were not accompanied by beatings. The guards carried rifles but often stood relaxed, conversing with one another rather than issuing commands. The camp fences were topped with barbed wire, yet the air was filled with the aroma of cooked meals wafting from the mess hall. Inside the barracks, there were cots arranged neatly, mattresses filled with genuine bedding, and even stoves for warmth during the colder months. It was hardly opulent, but it was far from the nightmare they had envisioned. The meals astonished them the most. The prisoners had anticipated thin soups or stale bread, the type of rations that many German civilians had to endure during the war. However, the trays brought into the dining halls featured generous portions, including meatloaf, potatoes, beans, coffee, milk, and occasionally fruit. The abundance seemed unbelievable. Men who had fought in icy fields on a diet of black bread and thin broth now found themselves with plates that resembled almost home-cooked meals. Some initially declined to eat, convinced that the food must be drugged or tainted. But hunger eventually triumphed over suspicion, and soon disbelief transformed into quiet gratitude. Rumors began to circulate. They provide us with better food than our own army did. In addition to food, the camps offered unexpected elements of normalcy. The Red Cross sent packages containing soap, toothpaste, and even writing supplies. Medical clinics provided care for injuries and ailments. Occasionally, guards distributed cigarettes, and certain camps even featured small libraries filled with books and newspapers. The prisoners were astonished to learn that they could write letters home, albeit with careful censorship. The simple act of writing and receiving responses from family felt miraculous, re-establishing a connection to the world they believed was lost. Discipline was present. Naturally, attempts to escape were met with punishment, and curfews were strictly enforced. However, the consequences were often confinement rather than severe violence. The Americans appeared more focused on maintaining order than on inflicting cruelty. This perspective unsettled the prisoners. They had been led to believe that Americans were merciless, decadent savages, incapable of discipline or fairness. Instead, they found themselves governed by rules that, while stringent, possessed an unusual sense of equity. The camps were intended to contain men, not to shatter them. Even the physical environment perplexed them. Many camps were situated in the rural regions of the American South, Midwest, and West. Through the fences, the prisoners could observe vast farmlands, forests, and small towns. Farmers occasionally worked in nearby fields, and in some instances, prisoners were permitted to assist with agricultural tasks under guard. They were taken aback to see American civilians treating them not with animosity, but with a curious indifference, as if they were merely another group of laborers passing through. Children sometimes waved at them. Women occasionally brought pies or bread to the guards, and the sight of such casual normalcy disturbed men who had believed America was solely a land of hostile adversaries. At night, when the barracks fell silent, many whispered about the peculiar circumstances. "Is this truly captivity?" one would inquire. Another would respond, "Perhaps they are preparing us for something worse." Yet others began to entertain a more perilous notion. Perhaps what we were told about America was incorrect. Seeds of doubt began to emerge during these hushed discussions. For individuals accustomed to perceiving the world in black and white, viewing the Reich as the apex of civilization and the Allies as uncivilized, the ordinary acts of kindness and comfort experienced in camp life posed a risk to the once unassailable beliefs they held. Nevertheless, no one could have anticipated the events that would unfold next. The Americans, it appeared, were not merely satisfied with offering sustenance, shelter, and security. They had something else planned, something so unforeseen and peculiar that many German detainees believed it to be a figment of their imagination. Soon, they would assemble in large halls or makeshift theaters, and for the first time since departing from home, they would be transported far beyond the confines of their camp, not through escape, but by the dazzling images cast upon a movie screen. The cadence of camp life gradually settled into patterns that both reassured and perplexed the German prisoners. Mornings commenced with roll call, followed by meals that continued to astonish men accustomed to meager rations back in their homeland. Many spent their hours on work details, often aiding on nearby farms or assisting in the upkeep of the camp itself. For soldiers who had endured months in muddy trenches, lifting hay bales or mending fences under the American sun felt almost like an unusual holiday. They were indeed under guard, but the labor was manageable, the compensation modest yet existent, and in exchange, they were treated more as workers than as condemned foes. Some even exchanged quiet jokes among themselves, asking, "If this is prison, what does freedom resemble?" The hours of leisure proved to be even more bewildering. Rather than enduring endless punishment drills or silence, there were opportunities for recreation. Soccer fields and volleyball courts emerged within the fenced enclosures, with prisoners forming teams and organizing matches. American guards occasionally observed, even cheered, and sometimes participated. Chessboards and card games were available in the barracks, and those with artistic skills in drawing or carving were permitted to engage in their crafts. Several camps established small orchestras with instruments supplied by the Red Cross, their melodies wafting through the air in the evenings. The ambiance was surreal. Men who had fiercely battled in North Africa and Europe now spent their nights performing Mozart or enjoying card games as if the war were a distant reality. The clothing also defied expectations. The issued camp uniforms were straightforward yet tidy, accompanied by durable shoes and coats for the colder seasons. In comparison to the tattered, lice-infested attire some had donned in combat, it was a significant improvement. Hygiene facilities provided soap, showers, and even barber services. German soldiers who had marched through towns reduced to ruins were taken aback by the basic dignity offered to them here. Some whispered anxiously, "Why are they treating us so kindly? What do they want from us?" Suspicion lingered, yet the truth was undeniable. Their American captors appeared more focused on ensuring their well-being than on breaking their spirits. Meals continued to spark endless discussions. The presence of white bread, real butter, meat, and milk astonished men who were aware that their families back home struggled to find potatoes and horsemeat. Rumors spread that prisoners received nearly the same rations as American soldiers. Some even felt a sense of guilt when writing home about their meals, knowing their mothers, wives, and children were enduring rationing and bombings. However, this abundance also sowed new doubts. How could Germany possibly triumph against a nation capable of providing such sustenance to its adversaries? Initially, entertainment came in smaller doses. Censored newspapers permitted in the camp disclosed fragments of a world beyond. Many prisoners were astonished by the openness with which American papers criticized their own government and military. This freedom of expression stood in stark contrast to the rigid propaganda apparatus of the Reich. The camp libraries offered a range of books, from classics of German literature to American novels translated into German. Experiencing the works of Mark Twain or Jack London by lamplight in a barracks felt almost surreal. Gradually, an unexpected image of America took shape. A land of contradictions, yet not the savage wasteland they had been conditioned to despise. However, the most significant surprise was still to come. As the evening settled and the camp's routine slowed, the men, filled with restless energy, found the Americans offering something more than just soccer fields and books. Prisoners were called to large halls or open spaces. A projector was installed. A white sheet was draped across a wall. Soon, beams of light pierced the darkness. Initially, the Germans could hardly believe their eyes. Moving images, larger than life, flickered into existence. The Americans were allowing their adversaries to watch films. Not propaganda, not lectures, but genuine Hollywood productions. For men confined behind barbed wire, it felt as though a gateway to another realm had suddenly opened. The disbelief that had begun with the provision of food and comfort now reached unprecedented levels. Could this really be occurring? As the first reels began to turn within the camps, a hush fell over the assembled prisoners. They had anticipated speeches, lectures, or perhaps even heavy-handed propaganda intended to humiliate them. Instead, the flickering light unveiled cowboys racing across arid plains, comedic actors navigating absurd predicaments, and glamorous stars performing and singing in ways the soldiers had never witnessed. The shock was instantaneous. For many, this was their inaugural encounter with American cinema, and the stark contrast to the grim propaganda films of the Reich was staggering. Rather than military parades and Führer speeches, there was laughter, music, and fantasy. It was as if a fragment of another universe had been brought forth through the barbed wire. The guards, positioned at the periphery of the makeshift theaters, observed with a blend of amusement and curiosity. They witnessed the hardened expressions of enemy soldiers transform into smiles, chuckles, and, at times, outright laughter. Some inmates applauded during comedic scenes, while others watched in astonishment at the vastness of the productions. For German men raised under strict discipline and enduring years of conflict, the abrupt immersion in tales of adventure and romance was exhilarating. Hollywood had breached the barriers and reached them in a way that no weapon could. Not every response was mere amusement. Some soldiers felt discomfort at the casual freedom depicted on screen. They observed men and women flirting openly, workers criticizing their superiors, and impoverished characters overcoming adversity through cleverness and charm. Such portrayals contradicted everything they had been taught about America, which was depicted as a land of corruption, chaos, and decay. Instead, they caught a glimpse of a society where even average individuals appeared to possess dreams and dignity. This contradiction troubled them in the darkness as the projector whirred away. Could it be that their leaders had deceived them about the enemy all along? Newsreels added another layer of astonishment. Although carefully curated, they frequently showcased the American war effort, bustling factories, fleets of ships, or soldiers marching with assurance. For prisoners who had first-hand knowledge of the dire supply situation in Germany, these visuals were nearly intolerable. The overwhelming abundance of machinery, the streams of tanks rolling off production lines, the throngs of well-nourished workers, all served as reminders that the Reich could not possibly outproduce its adversary. Yet even these revelations were presented not with malice, but almost nonchalantly, nestled between scenes of comedies and musicals. The Americans seemed to grasp that the strength of cinema resided not in didacticism, but in the gradual flow of images that eroded old convictions. What astonished the prisoners the most was that attendance was optional. No one compelled them to sit in front of the screen. They had the choice to stay in their barracks to play cards or write letters instead. Nevertheless, the halls quickly filled whenever the projector was set up. News of each screening spread swiftly. This evening they are presenting yet another Western, or perhaps a comedy tomorrow. Men who once marched under swastikas now found themselves eagerly anticipating evenings filled with American entertainment. Some began to compile mental lists of their favorite actors or genres, exchanging notes with fellow prisoners. Others confessed, with a blend of shame and amazement, that for a few hours they forgot they were captives at all. In the soft glow of the screen, something subtle transformed. The barbed wire receded into the background, and the war felt far away. The men were no longer merely prisoners of conflict. They had become spectators of narratives that transcended their own existence. The Americans, whether by design or not, had bestowed upon them a remarkable gift, a glimpse into a realm of imagination and humanity that no prison wall could entirely confine. As the credits rolled and the lights illuminated the room, disbelief lingered in the air. They could not comprehend why their adversaries permitted such indulgence. Yet, deep within, they understood they would forever remember the nights when Hollywood graced the camps. The evenings of film screenings evolved into a rhythm that the prisoners embraced with quiet anticipation. News would ripple through the barracks when the guards announced another show, and men who spent their days hauling lumber, mending fences, or laboring in fields suddenly found themselves rushing through dinner to secure a prime seat in front of the projector. For those ensnared behind barbed wire, these nights provided an escape that no tunnel could offer. The flickering light on the screen dissolved the fences, if only for 2 hours. The men leaned forward on benches or sat cross-legged on the floor, gazing into a world that appeared brighter, freer, and more vibrant than the one they had left behind in Germany. The selection of films astonished them. Comedies featuring Charlie Chaplin or the Marx Brothers sent waves of laughter through rooms filled with men who had not laughed freely in years. Westerns, characterized by their vast landscapes and clear-cut conflicts between good and evil, resembled morality tales set against a backdrop that was larger than life. Musicals, with their vibrant dance sequences and sparkling costumes, offered a different type of shock: the sheer extravagance of a nation capable of transforming life into song while simultaneously engaged in a global conflict. Additionally, there were romantic films featuring women with radiant smiles who delivered lines brimming with wit and independence. German soldiers, raised under strict gender norms, sat in astonished silence at these depictions of self-assured women, which starkly contrasted with the carefully curated images presented in Nazi cinema. For some, this experience bordered on a dangerous fascination. They found themselves discussing their favorite actors during work assignments, mimicking comedic dialogues, or humming tunes long after the credits had concluded. To openly appreciate enemy culture felt nearly like an act of betrayal, yet the irresistible allure of entertainment proved too powerful to resist. Even officers who attempted to suppress excessive enthusiasm could not overlook the magnetic attraction of the screen. When the lights dimmed, social hierarchies dissolved. Seasoned veterans sat alongside young recruits, all equally captivated by the unfolding narrative. The difference from the films produced by the Reich was striking. In Germany, cinema had served as a weapon, a means to glorify Hitler, the party, and the perpetual struggle against adversaries. The narratives were rigid, predictable, and laden with ideology. In contrast, the Americans appeared almost reckless in their liberty. Their films could ridicule authority, satirize the affluent, or celebrate the victories of ordinary individuals. The prisoners exchanged whispers, questioning, how could such disorder yield a nation robust enough to wage war across continents? Yet, with each film they viewed, they increasingly understood that this chaos was not a sign of weakness. It represented a form of vitality they had never encountered before. Some men began to write home about the film screenings, although censorship hindered comprehensive descriptions. We are presented with peculiar forms of entertainment, hinted at in a letter, that momentarily distract us from our current reality. Families back in Germany relying on ration cards and state-controlled news could hardly fathom such experiences. The notion that captured soldiers might watch American films seemed ludicrous. Yet within the camps, these screenings became one of the most discussed privileges, almost a form of currency for morale. Consequently, disbelief grew. German prisoners, conditioned to expect brutality, found themselves instead enveloped in laughter, music, and narratives. It wasn't freedom, but it offered a glimpse of something tantalizingly close to it. Each night spent at the movies left them feeling both thankful and uneasy, pondering why their adversaries permitted such indulgence and what impact it might have on their own loyalties and identities. The screen transformed from mere entertainment into a silent educator, reshaping their perceptions of the world and their place within it. As weeks turned into months, the nightly screenings began to cultivate something far deeper than mere amusement. The prisoners engaged in endless discussions about what they had witnessed, analyzing not only the storylines, but also the values embedded within them. A comedy might ignite debates about American humor, which seemed to thrive on mocking pompous authority and celebrating the underdog. A Western would spark conversations about freedom, justice, and the expansive landscapes symbolizing possibilities far beyond the ravages of war. Even romances, initially dismissed as trivial, unveiled unsettling truths. The open display of affection, women's independence, and casual social interactions hinted at a society far less constrained than the one they had left behind. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the films began to chip away at the rigid beliefs instilled in them through years of Nazi indoctrination. The guards observed this transformation. The hostility of new arrivals, once sharp and simmering, gradually dulled. Prisoners who had once vocally proclaimed the inevitability of German victory now grew quieter, their convictions shaken. Rather than dreaming of returning to a victorious Reich, many began to whisper about whether such a life of abundance and freedom could genuinely exist beyond the barbed wire. The films conjured images of supermarkets brimming with goods, of ordinary Americans enjoying laughter in theaters, and of music resonating in dance halls. These images starkly contrasted with the ration lines and bombed-out cities that awaited them back home. Even the most disciplined among them found it challenging to resist. Officers attempting to dismiss the films as mere propaganda struggled when their men pointed out how dissimilar these reels were from the rigid productions of Goebbels' ministry. "If this is propaganda," one soldier remarked after a musical, "then it is the most beautiful propaganda I have ever seen." Another replied, "Perhaps it is not propaganda at all, but simply a reflection of how they live." These conversations unveiled the perilous potential of entertainment. It transcended ideology and directly tapped into human yearning. The Americans may not have intended it as psychological warfare, yet the impact was undeniable. The more the prisoners laughed at American comedies, the harder it became to perceive the United States as a faceless enemy. The more they admired the resilience of characters overcoming adversity, the more they questioned the German assertion that only discipline and obedience led to strength. Films depicting communities uniting, individuals defying corrupt leaders, or ordinary people achieving greatness all challenged the authoritarian worldview they had brought into captivity. For younger soldiers, the movies were intoxicating. Teenagers raised on Hitler Youth rallies discovered a different kind of heroism in Hollywood, not bound to uniform and flag, but to individuality and courage. They scribbled actors' names in notebooks, learned English phrases from repeated viewings, and even attempted to mimic the swagger of American cowboys. What began as simple entertainment evolved into a cultural fascination. Letters sent home, despite being censored, subtly indicated significant changes. Families, reading between the lines, began to realize that captivity in America was not the dire experience they had anticipated. Some prisoners recounted how the films reminded them of peacetime, evoking memories of their youth before the ravages of war took hold. Others confided in their comrades about their fear of leaving the camp, worried they might never again experience such abundance, freedom, and lightheartedness. The initial disbelief during the first screenings gradually transformed into a more profound change in perspective. Although barbed wire still surrounded them, their minds began to expand beyond those confines. The allure of Hollywood infiltrated their thoughts, challenging their previously held beliefs. They had entered the camps as soldiers of the Reich, but slowly they were evolving into individuals who could no longer view the world in the same light. The Americans had discovered that cinema could soften even the toughest adversaries, not through force, but through storytelling. As the war approached its inevitable end, the prisoners started to envision what life would be like once the gates finally opened, allowing them to return to Germany. For many, the prospect of going home brought as much anxiety as it did hope. Letters and updates from the Red Cross revealed that their families were enduring bombings, shortages, and devastation. The cities they had once known were reduced to rubble, and the once mighty Reich was shrinking daily. The stark contrast between the harsh realities of home and the unexpected comforts of captivity in America weighed heavily on their minds. Among the stories they would carry back, none seemed more incredible than the nights spent watching American movies. When the war concluded in Europe and repatriations began, groups of men boarded ships once again, this time to cross the Atlantic in the opposite direction. They crowded the decks, gazing at the vast ocean, aware that they were leaving behind not just America, but the peculiar life they had experienced behind its barbed wire. They spoke in hushed tones, almost ashamed of the things they would miss: the food, the soccer matches, the cigarettes, and above all, the glow of the movie projector. "No one back home will believe it," one man remarked. "They'll think we've lost our minds." Another replied, "How can we explain that we laughed at American comedies while our cities were in flames?" The dilemma was palpable. Discussing their camp experiences openly risked disbelief or even accusations of disloyalty. Yet the story spread nonetheless. In villages across Germany, returning prisoners whispered of their surreal captivity. They recounted nights when thousands of men sat together in silence, captivated by the performances of Clark Gable or Ginger Rogers on screen. They spoke of vibrant musicals, cowboys riding through endless landscapes, and romances that embodied a freedom they had never known. Families listened in astonishment, struggling to fathom that their sons and husbands had laughed at films while the Reich crumbled around them. For many civilians, these accounts sounded like fantasy, or worse, deliberate fabrications meant to diminish the suffering experienced at home. Nevertheless, the memories clung to the men who had lived them. Some former prisoners admitted that those screenings had transformed their worldview. They could no longer accept the simplistic notion of a good Reich versus evil allies. They had glimpsed another facet of America, not just its military power, but its culture, humor, and ability to turn life into art. Even as they navigated the ruined streets of Germany and attempted to rebuild their lives, the glow of the screen lingered in their minds, serving as a quiet reminder of how much their perspectives had shifted. The most striking aspect of their stories was how ordinary the screenings appeared to the Americans. Guards casually set up projectors, treating the act of allowing prisoners to watch Hollywood films as if it were nothing out of the ordinary. To the Germans, the experience was nothing short of extraordinary, a surreal reversal of their expectations regarding captivity. Some expressed that it was the moment they recognized America as not just a superpower of machinery and weaponry, but also one of imagination. When reflecting on their time in American camps later in life, many veterans bypassed the specifics of labor or discipline. Instead, their voices softened at the mention of cinema nights. For them, those hours transcended mere distraction. They provided a respite from the burdens of war, a glimpse into a different future, and a memory that lingered long after the barbed wire had been removed. In the years that followed, the recollection of cinema nights within American prison camps became one of the most peculiar legacies of the war for those who experienced it. For many former prisoners of war, the image of sitting shoulder to shoulder with comrades while watching American films under the watchful gaze of guards was etched into their memories as deeply as the battles they had fought. It was a paradox they carried with them. They had been enemies of America, yet it was America that granted them moments of joy and humanity during the darkest times of their lives. When historians later interviewed these men, the topic of movies frequently resurfaced. Some laughed about how they had memorized lines from comedies or developed crushes on Hollywood actresses they had never anticipated seeing on screen. Others spoke more solemnly, acknowledging that the films offered their first glimpse of a world that contradicted the grim narrative propagated by Nazi propaganda. They recalled how those reels unveiled a society that cherished laughter, creativity, and individuality, qualities that had been nearly stifled under the rigid order of the Reich. The influence extended beyond personal memories. In post-war Germany, particularly during the Reconstruction years, American culture began to permeate the country more freely. Former prisoners of war often became unintentional ambassadors, sharing stories of the films they had watched while in captivity with family and friends. They described the humor, the music, the larger-than-life narratives, and the vibrant essence of Hollywood. For younger Germans, eager for something beyond the remnants of defeat, these accounts sparked curiosity about the United States. While the Marshall Plan rebuilt infrastructure, it was stories like these, of laughter behind barbed wire, that rekindled imaginations. Some veterans even acknowledged that their later acceptance of democracy and Western ideals could be traced back to those nights in captivity. Although no single film transformed a worldview, the consistent exposure to American cinema softened hardened soldiers in ways that bullets never could. The seeds sown in those makeshift theaters blossomed years later when former adversaries found themselves part of a new West Germany, aligned with the very nation they had once fought against. In this light, the glow of the movie projector emerged as a quiet, unexpected tool of reconciliation. Yet disbelief never entirely vanished. Even decades later, former prisoners would chuckle and shake their heads while recounting the experience. "We were the enemy," they would say, "and they let us watch movies." To them, it remained a testament to America's overwhelming confidence and abundance. A nation so powerful, it could afford to entertain its captives. Perhaps it also reflected something deeper. The notion that culture and imagination could serve as weapons just as formidable as guns and tanks. The legacy of those screenings endured not only in memory but also in the cultural bridge they helped construct. Men who had once marched for Hitler returned home with a secret narrative of nights filled with laughter and music in prison halls. They shared with their children and grandchildren how they had seen America, not through the sights of a rifle, but through the glow of a movie screen. In that strange, flickering light, they discovered that even in captivity, humanity could endure, and even amidst war, the seeds of peace could be sown.